Hello, Unwrappers. Just a quick note before we begin this week's show, and that is that we are going to be appearing live on October the 5th as part of the Podcast Live Politics event in central London. There's plenty of other podcasts doing a live show as well, so you can come and make a day of it. Details at podcastlive.com. So if you've always listened to this show and thought, yes, but what do they really look like? Do they actually have any views on Brexit? You can come and ask us those questions in person and see a recording of the show. For tickets, go to podcastlive.com and use the code WEEK10, WEEK10, at the checkout for a 10% discount on your ticket price. And now on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday, the 17th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen conspiracy theories surrounding the death of Jeffrey Epstein, high tensions in Hong Kong, and Steve Coogan using Alan Partridge to swerve a driving ban. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, we have Kari, Wilkin, Rebecca, Gillie and Gabriel Power. Starting the show this week, it's Kari. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Hold your horses. Is the smart money on Mongolia?
So I'm going to tell you the name, but I want to say some things about the name first. I would like to name the horse after a army officer who served in China between 1924 and 1927. This young army officer was in charge of an infantry regiment, which he outfitted with horses. He sought the best horses from the region, so he came to Mongolia and procured horses for his infantry regiment. As the story goes, a young lieutenant under his command disciplined by striking a horse that was a little stubborn. This army officer punished the lieutenant for striking the horse because he had such high regard for Mongolian horses.
God, foreign diplomacy is weird, isn't it? That was US Defense Secretary Mark Esper being presented with a horse in Mongolia last week. Kari, what happened this week?
Well, this actually happened while we were recording last week, so I think it just edges in. And this was actually the third US engagement with Mongolia by the US in recent weeks. So basically, Mark Esper went along. He was presented with this horse, which he named Marshall, after former Defence Secretary George Marshall.
Not the dog in Paw Patrol?
No. Well, that was his story anyway. And this is actually a very common gift to give to foreign dignitaries. These are traditional horses that were ridden by warriors, including Genghis Khan. And in fact, Donald Trump's son, Barron, was given another of these horses.
Hold on, is your story actually about horses?
It's not. I just like the little horse motif. These are common gifts to give to foreign dignitaries, and clearly I think it just shines the spotlight on the fact that Mongolia and the US are trying to strengthen their ties. And in fact, the Mongolian president in July went and visited the White House and gave Donald Trump's son Barron one of these horses symbolically. He didn't actually take it with him. And this was during talks on trade and military sales. And in June, the National Security Advisor John Bolton also went to Mongolia.
I'll leave aside the issue of how you can symbolically gift a horse and ask you, Gabriel, why you think it might be that the US and Mongolia appear to be seeking stronger ties, as Kari is suggesting.
Well, from a US perspective, it's because of its geographical location. It's in between Russia and China. It's the US's two biggest, I suppose, adversaries. Certainly, tensions have ramped up between China and the US and Russia, I suppose, in the last few years since the election of Trump. And so Mongolia seems a very willing diplomatic partner for the US in a geographic region where two great superpowers are quite hostile to them. Ever since the end of the Cold War, Mongolia has made attempts to kind of distance itself from Soviet and communist ideologies and distance itself from Russia. And at the moment, it's trying to kind of drive out a lot of its Russian language institutions. And I feel like the fact that they constantly refer to themselves as third neighbors and have done for many years is indicative that they want to increase trade ties, but at the same time, they haven't really done so. The statistics say that Mongolia is all about trade with China, not the US.
And when you say they refer to themselves as third neighbours, I mean, of course, the US never mentions Mongolia, does it? Hardly ever in public statements in English. Mongolia, I'm sure, mentions the US a lot more frequently than they're mentioned by the US, a bit like our special relationship, Rebecca. Why suddenly would Trump be really interested in this?
Yeah, it's the classic, I'm her best friend, but she's not my best friend. But to be fair, Mongolia does refer to other countries as third neighbours, which kind of strains the numerical premise. South Korea and Japan have also been third neighbour nominees. And yeah, you're right. Geographic location is a huge part of it, but then also Mongolia has always been sandwiched between Russia and China. What seems to be going on at the moment in Mongolia is there is, as well as an attempt to distance itself from Russia, and Mongolia used to be a communist regime as well, but as Gabe said, they've been trying to distance themselves from that. They're also distancing themselves increasingly from China, not economically. Again, as Gabe was saying, the vast majority of their trade is with and through China, but definitely politically. President Batulga was elected on a populist and quite anti-Chinese platform. Obviously, Mongolia has to kind of play it safe because China is still their main partner. But at the same time, there is a growing feeling among Mongolian voters that they want to put a bit of space between themselves and Beijing. And I think if you look at how China has been acting around the world recently with its Belt and Road Initiative, investing in different parts of the world, South Pacific, etc., basically trying to establish as much geopolitical influence as possible, it's possibly wise for Mongolia to try and get at arm's length.
But that's what's in it for Mongolia. My question is, what's in it for Trump's America? I mean, is it literally a military base? Is that it?
I think, as Rebecca said, that trade war, the US trade war with China, that's part of it. You know, you've got China and Russia investing, as Rebecca said, in South Pacific, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And it's all about trying to form these economic ties, which then, of course, leads to diplomatic ties. So the US is trying to land Mongolia as an economic ally. And at the same time, that ties into other issues such as military support. Mongolia actually has lots of natural resources which China and Russia desperately need. You know, this is a country that's 6 times the size of the UK with a population of just 3 million people. So they've got all of these natural resources going free: gold, coal, copper. Yet at the same time, Mongolia's debt in recent years has surged, the currency value's plummeted, the national budget deficit has widened, so it's ripe for the plucking. And part of the reason I think that it's run into these economic problems is because it's so dependent on trade with China, which has also seen its economy slow. So this is the perfect time for the US to swoop in and form these economic ties, which is also very helpful in terms of military bonds, and just because of the strategic place, the geographical position of Mongolia, that's very handy in the event of needing to launch any sort of attack on either Russia or China.
And ripe for the plucking, but over the years they've shown very strong will not to be plucked, haven't they, by both China and Russia? And I guess this is part of this, isn't it? They're very keen on maintaining their sovereignty.
Although I'd say that a lot of the trade ties and diplomatic efforts they've made with the US and the rest of the Western world have been fairly grounded in symbolism rather than anything quantifiable. For instance, Mongolia signed a deal with the US to waive import tariffs on cashmere wool, which is one of Mongolia's largest exports, so kind of stop a lot of it going to China, but the true effect of the deal is probably not going to be that great.
And if you actually look at the figures here, the US-Mongolian trade relations failed to clear $100 million in 2017, which is nothing in the great scheme of things, whereas almost 90% of Mongolian exports went to China. So it seems to be more lip service than reality, certainly so far.
OK, repercussions for the rest of the world is what we're supposed to be discussing on this show, Rebecca. I mean, how is this going to affect us in Western Europe, let's say?
Well, I've got one for you, which is we talked a bit about Mongolia's natural resources, and as well as copper, coal, gold, etc., they also have some of the world's biggest reserves of what's called rare earths, which is 17 elements that you've probably never heard of, and I honestly can't name any of them to you now. The more obscure end of the periodic table, but they are used in all kinds of advanced technological manufacturing procedures, things like nuclear batteries, lasers, military uses. Basically, they're extremely important for technology. And I think that's going to be potentially one area of contention in the future between Mongolia, US, Russia, China, because those materials are incredibly important and they're only going to become more important in the future.
Mongolia also offers valuable links to a variety of countries that usually wouldn't communicate. It's one of the few countries in the world that has good relations with both South and North Korea, which could be really useful to Trump. He could use that as leverage in his bid to revive the denuclearization talks, for example. So, and it does still, although it's trying to distance itself from China and Russia, it does still have pretty good relationships with both of them. So in fact, it's sort of a physical and diplomatic buffer, if you like, between all these different countries.
That being said, though, I don't want to be the person that constantly jumps in and just criticizes Mongolia and US relations, but Mongolia did, seeing itself as the world's third neighbor, seemingly, it did put itself forward as a host for the first summit, the Singapore summit, between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And the world just kind of said, nah, which indicates that maybe Mongolia kind of overrates its position on the world stage, because as Kari said, it does have a very small population. And while it does have a wealth of natural resources, the countries that would be looking to benefit from that can also look elsewhere, and they also have a lot of their own resources. And so the importance of Mongolia from a trade capacity and a diplomatic stance is up for debate.
If you'd like to read more about Mongolia, there is a week deep dive at theweek.co.uk. Just click on podcast. We're going to take a brief break, during which I'm going to ask Rebecca to name as many elements on the periodic table that she can, and she'll be back with her story after this. Rebecca, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
My love is like a red, red simile.
So what you're now experiencing is more exam papers than any generation before, with more content. You go through an exam period which is really a test of your stamina and resilience, your ability to keep going when papers go bad. Because with that many papers, if you're sitting 30 exam papers, the chances of 20 of those not being perfect the way you want are inevitable. You're going to come across loads of questions where you think, I can't do this, I've done really badly. Everyone will experience that. And consequently, you're in a constant state of anxiety, and you probably don't try your best in all the exam papers, because in some of them you're not feeling it, you just think you're rubbish.
YouTuber Mr. Salis teaches English there, talking about the exam system. And Rebecca, this is the week where a lot of A-level students get their A-level results, but you want to talk about GCSEs.
Yeah, well, see, now it does kick off on the subject of A-levels. We heard this week that there has been a 13% drop in the number of students choosing to do English language and literature A-levels, and that has been attributed to changes in the GCSE system.
Aha.
Yes. So you may or may not, depending on how many GCSE age students you come into contact with, know that GCSEs were reformed a couple of years ago. If you've heard anything about it, you've probably heard about the grades being changed from A to G to a 1 to 9 system. But there's been lots of other changes as well, designed to make the curriculum more rigorous, especially in the core subjects, English, maths and science.
So these were the Michael Gove reforms, weren't they?
Yeah, and so
Read lots of Dickens, basically, as far as I could work out is what it was.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And so the students who are going in for A-levels are the first cohort of students to have taken these new reformed GCSE exams. And education leaders, campaigners and some authors as well have been coming out and saying that the reason for this drop is the changes to GCSE English, that it's putting students off
from studying English at a higher level. Is that a problem, folks? I mean, if slightly fewer people study English at a higher level, I mean, I've got an English degree, so I'm somewhat biased in this. I think it's a good thing. But the point against people studying English is that it's not directly vocational, people say.
Good English is at the root of everything. It's in every industry. You need to be able to communicate, whether you're a scientist, a journalist, whatever. If you can't express yourself clearly, you're not going to get very far in most professions.
Yes, but the argument of university costs a lot more than it used to, therefore if you're going to go on to study something where there's a job afterwards.
I think that
does apply more to art subjects than science subjects, doesn't it?
I think this is part of the problem in terms of the drop in the uptake of A-levels. I do think obviously these GCSEs are a major factor, but also just the whole government message of English being disparaged as the easy option and this alleged lack of job opportunities in the arts, which is really damaging, especially in a period of economic stability. So I think, terrified students are sort of saying, well, I can't afford to take English even if I do enjoy it. And I think that's hugely damaging.
Gabriel, what do you think the reason is? Do you think it's that the GCSE is too boring and people are put off? Or do you think it's this suspicion that there'll be a problem getting a career afterwards?
Well, I mean, it could be a combination of both, or it could be neither of those things, because the Joint Council for Qualifications, which represents exam boards in the UK, revealed recently that A-level English study dropped 15% between 2016 and 2018, which was prior to the reforms that were brought in. So there's an argument to say that this was already happening before.
Applications to study English at university also dropped in the same period, so it can't all be to blame for the GCSE, even though that may be fueling this downturn.
Okay, but the suspicion is, from what I can see, Rebecca, amongst teachers online, albeit people in teaching unions who tend to publish about teaching tend to be quite a lefty lot. The suspicion seems to be it's because the government made the GCSE English syllabus so boring. Is that true?
Well, I guess that depends on your interpretation of what English should be about, but they certainly have changed a lot. The word rigorous is used a lot by Michael Gove at the time when these reforms were introduced. So what that means in practice, firstly, no more coursework. Now the whole grade is based on exams taken in exam conditions, and also students are no longer allowed to bring the books they've studied in with them to the exam. So, that can be quite daunting for a lot of students. They may find that experience puts them off. It doesn't allow students who work better in coursework type projects rather than in exam conditions, doesn't allow them to shine. And also not being able to bring the texts into the exam means that students are being encouraged to memorize a lot of quotes and extracts by heart. Some English teachers have argued isn't really what English is about, and it's really about the government trying to turn the study of English into quite a mechanical scientific process where students aren't rewarded for giving their own interpretations of text. It's all about looking at the text and saying, this is an example of a metaphor, this is an example of onomatopoeia, etc., rather than encouraging students to express themselves, and that may in turn be killing their passion for literature.
There's a much greater emphasis on spelling and punctuation and grammar, and God knows, as a sub-editor, I think that's hugely important. But at the same time, you're losing that creativity behind it, the love of it, what makes you love language. That, if anything comes afterwards, you've got to instill that love first before you get down to the building blocks of language, and they've got it backwards, focus on that second. They've axed the study of spoken language and of poetry from other cultures. It's just got very narrow and seems quite regressive, the approach that they've now taken. It feels like we've gone back decades from where we were.
And deliberately so. I mean, that was the government's policy, wasn't it? They basically said, let's take the study of English back decades. I mean, that is what they promised to deliver, and that is what they delivered.
Michael Gove promised that the curriculum in English literature would be based on canon, i.e. pale, male, stale type literature. So everyone studies a Shakespeare play, everybody studies a Victorian novel. And if you look, the three main exam boards, AQA, OCR, EdExcel, for English, the only three texts that appear on all three of their curricula for the GCSE English exam are Animal Farm by George Orwell, and In Spectacles, which is J.B. Priestley, and Anita and Me by Mira Sayol. So of those three, two of them were written by white British men in 1945. So it's not the most diverse curriculum.
I sort of thought you were going to say the one that appears on everything is, Great Expectations or something.
That does appear on one or two of the three, but not all three of them. And I mean, it's not, in some ways, it's not that radical a change. I mean, when I studied GCSEs, that's, going back quite a few years now, we also studied a Shakespeare play. We also studied many of the texts that are still on the curriculum, but we also studied poetry and short stories, and those are no longer studied, for instance.
Is it not more down to how you study it, rather than just learning, as Rebecca said, these endless passages of text just by rote? And it's losing the creativity in terms of the interpretation.
Yeah, well, I mean, is there an argument to say that that's come from a kind of snobbishness and exclusivity around STEM fields? I feel like there's been a huge obsession with them in recent years. And also, when was the last time... Sorry, I say this in a room full of journalists. When was the last time you applied for a journalism job and it didn't ask for some... In fact, no, even in non-journalistic fields, it didn't ask for some level of, creativity or whatever. It doesn't have to be dry. I'm not quite understanding why we've boiled down English into this very by numbers slog. Although I did find it very dull when I did it 15 years ago.
I think in a way it is an attempt to ape STEM subjects with the kind of misguided idea that that's going to give English a legitimacy if everyone is encouraged to interpret the same things in the same way and come up with the correct conclusions, that makes English, a more legitimate subject, which obviously just isn't true. And also the new curriculum emphasises reading widely. For instance, there's now an unseen passage in the exam. And while I definitely support the idea in theory that obviously students should be reading as widely as possible, I really do think that that's the kind of thing gives such an unfair advantage to privileged students who are encouraged by their parents and family to read widely from a young age and given lots of books to read.
But there you come down to the difference maybe between the ways that independent schools with smaller class sizes and perhaps actually not qualified teachers teach these subjects versus state schools, because there is quite a prescriptive way of going through the curriculum, isn't there? If you're in a state school, isn't it just as much about the way that it's taught as it is about the text you're going to be examined on when you get to the end of it. I mean, if along the way you've encountered lots of different texts and you've looked at minority voices and you've looked at women writers and whatever, in a way it doesn't matter if in the final exam you're studying Animal Farm.
Yeah, and this is yet another case where in state schools, teachers are being pressured from above to teach to the exam. And so pupils are not getting a chance to engage in a more, more informal, a more relaxed, creative way with text.
And this whole emphasis on you must tick these boxes, you must get these good ratings from Ofsted. There's this fear to just let children sort of go a bit more off field because they may not then get the answers that are required in order for the schools to get these good ratings, which ties into so many different issues. But also I think going back to what Gabe was saying about the government focus on the STEM subjects, uptake of science, technology, engineering and maths is soaring at the same time that English is dropping. And I do think that's part of the problem, along with English being disparaged as an easy option. It's just that children are pushed so forcefully now to take these science subjects.
And I could finish on this by asking you the easy question of, what was the set text that inspired you? And you can all say, I read The Crucible and now I wanted to be a journalist. What was the set text at school that you found so boring you thought about not studying English anymore?
Anything by James Joyce.
Gabriel?
Well, mine was Inspector Calls, and it was so boring that I changed to music and then studied that instead. And somehow I've ended up a journalist.
Rebecca?
No escape.
Hard Times by Charles Dickens.
Wow, that's a great book.
Honestly, it's the most depressing book. And it also...
It's short and it's funny.
It's not that short.
It's
and
short.
Dickens is the kind of person who thinks it's clever to call a cruel teacher Chokum child. No, it's not funny. It's sad and miserable. And we had to watch the TV adaptation with Timothy West with everyone glued-on sideburns.
I'm so jealous.
Okay, well, I actually think An Inspector Calls is really good as well, although I agree with you on James Joyce. Mine was The Red Pony by John Steinbeck. Thanks for asking. One last story to come after this. And so finally this week, it's Gabriel. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Self-destruction may be in our DNA.
It's bad enough to catch a disease naturally, but to take a disease and turn it into a weapon, to enhance the disease, to make it more virulent or more contagious or resistant to known vaccines, that's particularly, it just kind of goes off the charts there. It's turning Mother Nature against us.
CNS senior fellow Amy Smithson from Invisible Threat, part of Al Jazeera's Witness documentary series. They're all available to stream now. Gabriel, what's she on about?
Well, she's talking about I'd say growing, but it's been a kind of consistent threat of bioweapons, which is the use of things like diseases and poisons to target certain population groups. Cambridge University Centre for the Study of Existential Risk this week published a massive report about pretty much all of the ways in which the world could end horribly. And one of the things that they mentioned was that governments are not doing enough to prepare for the threat of killer pathogens that could be designed using DNA to kill only people of a particular race, which is a concept known as an ethnic bioweapon. And it's been around for decades, but it's been mainly
in sci-fi? It sounds like sci-fi.
I mean, sci-fi and conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones and that sort of thing. But there's still a decent contingent of scientists around the world who continue to put it forward as a legitimate threat, although very few people can actually explain how it would work. And when they do, other scientists then jump in and say, no, you're wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different thing, isn't it, saying that there's a legitimate threat that this is going to happen soon, which is what Gabriel's implying, to what this report from Cambridge actually says, which is governments aren't preparing for it. Well, maybe they're not preparing for it because they don't think it's a legitimate threat that could happen soon.
I do think reporting on the findings of what this Centre for the Study of Existential Risk has been spun, to put it mildly. There's one line in the whole report, and this is from an organisation whose business it is to look for danger. So I think you have to be careful of reading too much into this. On the other hand, the British Medical Association and Red Cross have been warning that ethnic bioweapons are a risk since the early 2000s. So it does seem to be viewed by many legitimate organisations as a potential threat. Whether it's immediate or not is a different matter.
But in practical terms, I mean, the sort of suggestion of all this, Rebecca, is, if Hitler had a biological weapon that would kill only gypsies and Jews, then he'd have released gas in Berlin, and overnight that would kill those people and not the other people. That would be horrifying for everyone left behind. Like, the whole point of the hideousness of the Holocaust was that it was done without the general population fully understanding what was happening. I mean, this isn't a weapon you would employ if you wanted the people that vote for you to stay on your side.
Absolutely, and I do think that the fear has been overblown, certainly in the press reports. I'm sure that the centre itself, has proportional fears about how likely this is to happen. But I think it's extremely hard to imagine any state actor ever employing a weapon like this. If you think about the consequences of that, it would mean total isolation on the world stage. The only country that can conceivably risk using such technology is North Korea, which is certainly not going to happen anytime soon. With non-state actors, there is more of a potential. You can imagine if ISIS had the access to that kind of technology, that kind of biological weapon, that they might employ it. But I just think, we're still going core. Isn't it amazing that ISIS had its own magazine?
They'd want to target people as well who were mentally unprepared to convert to Islam. I mean, that's not. I can't imagine any DNA sequencing helping with that.
No, yeah, exactly. No, that's the problem. I mean, race and things like that. Apart from the issues that we've just been saying about how a lot of the determining factors that, say, fanatical groups like ISIS, if they got hold of such a weapon, would want to kind of weed out, it's the fact that race is not determined by a single gene. And, there's too much genetic similarities between different races. It just wouldn't work. A study in 2004 by David Goldstein, who's a geneticist, showed that the kind of, in very inverted commas, best case scenario for somebody using that weapon would be to kill 20% of one group and 28% of another. Like, that's the variable. It's not like 100% of one ethnicity and 0 of the other. There'd be a huge crossover, and it would basically just be a regular bioweapon, not an ethnic bioweapon.
And what scientist would research on this science?
And you've also got the problem of mutation. A virus specific to a single genotype or combination of genes could mutate, as viruses do in the natural world, to target another combination of genes. So it'd be hugely risky for all concerned to do this.
Okay, so we seem to all be saying that this is quite an unlikely technology to be put into a bioweapon. But what if people started looking at genetics in ways that would be politically popular? I mean, what if you could, for example, put something in the water that would suppress the sexual instincts of paedophiles?
Different governments are scared that their citizens' DNA is being collected by foreign agents to do these sort of things. Russia has apparently accused the US of taking its citizens' DNA and sending them abroad for analysis, possibly to develop such bioweapons or something, as you said, along those lines. The US has denied this, but during the Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union had researchers working on biological agents that could be weaponized against each other. And as you say, weaponized doesn't have to mean something killer. It could be about something that warps the human personality, if you like.
During the Cold War, US scientists experimented with what was called I think they called it a love bomb. It was like a gas-based weapon that would turn soldiers gay. And that they would launch these into the Soviet,
I know that that's the worst thing they could think of.
Oh my God. Into the Soviet regiments, and they would be so distracted with their new homosexual urges to one another that they would be unable to continue the fight. So as a concept, I think this idea that you can use biological warfare to affect your enemies, to transform them in some way, the concept has been around for a long time.
There are so many conspiracy theories surrounding it all. There's a theory that HIV was developed to target specific ethnic groups and that Israel's working on a bioweapon that can kill Arabs but not Jews. I mean, obviously, a lot of them are clearly barking, but you can see how this could fuel paranoia among different governments, if nothing else, and authorities.
One thing I would say, though, okay, we've known for a while that some people are less susceptible to anthrax poisoning than others, but in 2012, we discovered that that depends at least partially on a person's genetic makeup. And researchers took cells from African, Asian, European, and North American people, and although many of them fell at the first hurdle, as soon as they were exposed to anthrax, they died. These are cells, not people, I should say. The cells of 3 people only of European descent required hundreds or even thousands more times as much anthrax toxin to kill them. So there's an argument to say that it is possible, but that's such a small sample size. I mean,
I think whether that can be weaponized or not, I think reports on this sort of thing has repercussions for wider medical research. People are already wary of allowing the sharing of their genomic data. Use of DNA for legitimate purposes could be under threat just from these sorts of reports, whether they're correct or not. And possibly it just reaffirms the need for more stringent data security measures.
Well, and that was the point of this report, wasn't it, Gabriel, which you brought to the table? They're saying governments should be spending more on preparing for this. Should they, and how would they go about doing that?
In all honesty, I'm not sure. I mean, they don't even seem to suggest any solutions themselves. They've formulated this large report. It seems like one of these reports comes out every 5 years, maybe every 10 years, and have been since, 1940. We've been looking at the concept of ethnic bioweapons or bioweapons that affect genomes for decades and decades and decades, and yet nothing ever comes of it. There is also an argument that if we manage to harness biological information and gene editing technology to use in a weapon, then there's also an argument that we could use the exact same technology to defend against it. But how that works, I don't know.
There we go. We'll leave you with the thought of what the trident of genetic bioweapons might be. My thanks to Gabriel Power, Kari, Wilkin and Rebecca Gillie. That is it for our love bombing this week. You can subscribe to our show and hear new episodes every 7 days. And don't forget those fine magazines, The Week and The Week Junior, are also available every week from your local newsagent, as well as online. We are at Week Unwrapped on Twitter if you fancy telling us what you make of this week's show. And if you enjoy the podcast, please write a review on Apple Podcasts, which helps other people discover us too. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer, Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.